Can you truly, deeply imagine the sheer weight of a secret that lasts for 30 years? Can you conceive the notion that the woman you spent your entire life viewing through the lens of a master, someone you treated as a mere shadow in the kitchen, a nameless servant of the Oakwood Estate, was, in the most literal and biological sense, the very source of your existence? Today, we are not just telling a story. We are peeling back the layers of a historical tragedy that shook the very foundations of the American South. We are stepping into the corridors of power and the shanties of despair to uncover a secret that dismantled a sprawling empire and shattered a man's identity into a million irreparable pieces. In the next hour, you will not just listen, but you will feel the humid air of South Carolina in the 1850s. You will bear witness to the horrific, desperate, and ultimately devastating bargain a mother named Maria made to ensure her flesh and blood would never know the sting of a lash. You will learn about the silent, hidden marks of heritage, the haunting reality of a life built on a golden lie, and the inevitable collapse when the truth finally claws its way out of the red clay. Stay with us, for the journey we are about to take into the heart of Oakwood will alter your perception of blood, loyalty, and the terrifying lengths of a mother's love. The setting of our drama is the Oakwood Estate, a place where the red clay of South Carolina seems to hold onto its secrets with a stubborn, iron-like grip. In the mid-19th century, Oakwood was not merely a plantation. It was a sovereign kingdom that commanded the very horizon. To look upon Oakwood was to look upon the absolute manifestation of Southern aristocracy and power. The mansion itself was a marvel of Greek Revival architecture, with massive white pillars that stood like unyielding sentinels, visible for miles across the emerald green tobacco and cotton fields. These pillars were designed to project strength, purity, and an eternal order, but the grandeur of Oakwood was a meticulously crafted illusion. It was a beautiful, porcelain mask covering a world of systemic cruelty and human bondage. Beneath the majestic shade of those ancient oaks, hundreds of souls lived and died in silence. Their names were never etched in stone. Their lives were reduced to mere figures in a leather-bound financial ledger, their humanity stripped away by the very laws of the land. The master of the house, Thomas Williams, was a man of absolute authority. To him, the world was divided into those who owned and those who were owned. He walked through his halls with the heavy tread of a man who believed God had personally ordained his status. His wife, Elizabeth, was the porcelain doll of the South, elegant, fragile, but haunted by a deep, etching emptiness. For years, the mansion had been silent, devoid of the laughter or cries of a child. This lack of an heir was the only crack in the Williams armor. Every night, Elizabeth would pray in front of her silver-framed icons, begging for a son to carry the family name into the next century. She felt the pressure of the Williams legacy pressing down on her shoulders like a leaden cloak. Among the forgotten souls in the shadows was Maria. To Thomas Williams, Maria was nothing more than a sit number 42 high-functioning kitchen hand meant to ensure the silver was polished and the tea was served at exactly the right temperature. But Maria was much more than a servant. She was the silent, invisible observer of everything that transpired within the walls of that great house. She knew the secret rhythm of the mansion better than the people who owned it. She knew the exact creak of the floorboards that signaled the master's heavy, bourbon-fueled footsteps. She knew the precise way the mistress, Elizabeth Williams, would let out a long, weary sigh when she thought the world wasn't watching. Maria was pregnant, her body heavy with a child whose only legal inheritance was expected to be iron shackles, a lifetime of grueling toil under a merciless sun, and a soul-crushing lack of freedom. At the very same time, within the lavishly decorated master suite, Elizabeth Williams was also expecting an heir. The contrast was a bitter, jagged pill to swallow. One child was destined to be born into hand-stitched French silk, surrounded by a golden future of education and privilege. The other was destined to be born onto a burlap sack in a cabin where the wind whistled through the cracks in the wood, destined for a life of servitude. Maria looked up at the towering, moonlit mansion every single night, her heart heavy with a primal, maternal desperation. She knew that in this world, her child's only crime would be the color of his skin and the status of his mother. The night of September 14, 1854, felt as though the very fabric of the world was being torn asunder. A monstrous hurricane-strength storm battered the South Carolina coast, and the wind shrieked through the chimneys of Oakwood like a vengeful banshees. The trees groaned under the pressure, and the rain fell in sheets so thick they obscured the very light of the stars. Inside the master's suite, Elizabeth Williams was locked in the throes of a brutal, agonizing labor that seemed to defy the efforts of the town's finest physician. Downstairs, Thomas Williams paced the library like a caged animal, numbing his mounting anxiety with glass after glass of expensive bourbon, praying to a God he only acknowledged in times of crisis for a son to secure his legacy. He could hear his wife's screams echoing through the vents, mixing with the howling wind outside. Simultaneously, in a drafty, lightless cabin behind the smokehouse, Maria lay on a bed of dry straw. Her only comfort was Sarah, an elderly midwife who had seen 1,000 births and just as many tragedies, a woman whose hands were calloused by a lifetime of labor. There was no medicine here, no silk sheets, only the raw, unfiltered reality of life and death. Maria's labor was swift and fierce, a mirror to the storm outside. She clutched Sarah's hand, her knuckles white, her breath coming in ragged gasps, as a massive, bone-shaking crack of lightning split the midnight sky. A chilling, unnatural silence fell over the great house. Elizabeth's child was born a boy, but he was cold. His lungs refused to take in the air of the world he was meant to inherit. The physician tried everything, shaking the small body, rubbing the chest, but there was no response. The Williams heir, the one the entire county had been waiting for, was stillborn. The dynasty was over before it could begin. The doctor looked at Thomas Williams and slowly shook his head. The master of Oakwood felt a vacuum open in his chest, a void of grief and failed pride. But only moments later, in the flickering, dying shadow of a tallow candle in the slave quarters, Maria's son let out a piercing, vibrant, and life-affirming cry that seemed to defy the very storm itself. Maria looked down at her son, healthy, strong, and possessed of a complexion so fair that he could easily vanish into the world of the masters if the light hit him just right. She saw his tiny fingers grasping the air, a symbol of life in a place of death. In a moment of divine madness and absolute maternal ferocity, Maria realized that the darkness of the storm offered a singular, terrifying opportunity. She whispered a frantic, desperate deal to the midwife, Sarah. Sarah hesitated, her eyes wide with terror at the thought of the consequences if they were caught. But Maria's eyes held a fire that would not be extinguished. "He will be a king," Maria hissed. "He will never know the whips. He will be free." Under the cover of the roaring thunder and the chaz of the mansion's grief, the babies were switched. Sarah, moving like a phantom through the back corridors she knew so well, carried the living child into the mansion and the dead child out. Maria held the cold, lifeless body of the mistress's child to her breast and wept not just for the dead babe, but for the son she was about to lose to a world of lies. She felt the chill of the dead infant against her skin, a permanent reminder of the price of her son's freedom. Her living son was wrapped in royal silk and placed into the golden, hand-carved cradle of the main house. When the sun rose over a rain-soaked Oakwood, the air was thick with the scent of wet earth and jasmine. A grand celebration began for the birth of Arthur Williams. Bells rang out across the valley, and champagne was poured for the neighboring plantation owners. Meanwhile, Maria quietly and alone buried a child in the slave cemetery, marking the spot with nothing but a small, smooth stone. She carried a secret that would eat at her soul for the next 30 years. A secret that would define every breath she took from that moment on. Years turned into decades, and the secret of Oakwood remained buried deeper than the roots of the ancient oaks themselves. Arthur Williams grew up in a world of absolute, unquestioned privilege. He was the golden son of the South, a young man who moved through the world with the effortless grace of someone who believed the very earth was created for his footsteps. He was sent to the finest universities, He mastered multiple languages, and he learned the intricate codes of Southern honor. To the world he was the perfect Hertol, charismatic, and possessed of a commanding presence. But to Maria, who watched him from the periphery of his life, he was a living, breathing miracle that she could never truly touch. Maria was assigned as Arthur's primary nurse, a role that was both her greatest joy and her most exquisite torture. She was the one who tended to his every need. She was there to soothe his feverish brow when he was a toddler. She was the one who stitched his torn clothes and prepared his favorite meals. She watched him take his first steps on the polished mahogany floors of the mansion steps she had stolen for him. Every time he reached out his small hand to hers, Maria felt a surge of love, so powerful it threatened to choke her. But she had to maintain the mask. She had to address her own son as Master Arthur. She had to bow when he entered the room and stand in silence while he was praised for his Williams heritage. As Arthur entered his late teens and early 20s, a coldness began to settle into his character, the inevitable byproduct of a society that taught him he was superior by birth. He began to treat Maria not with the affection of a child for his nurse, but with the detached, often cruel indifference of a master for a servant. One afternoon, after a failed hunt, a frustrated Arthur turned his anger toward Maria because his tea was not hot enough. He shattered the porcelain cup on the floor and unleashed a torrent of verbal abuse, calling her clumsy and worthless, threatening to have her sent to the fields if she didn't improve. Maria stood there, her eyes fixed on the floor, watching the tea soak into the rug. She didn't say a word. Internally, she was bleeding, but she accepted every insult as a sacred sacrifice. She whispered to herself in the dark of her cabin that night, "Let him be cruel. His cruelty is the proof that he believes he is a king. My humiliation is the price of his crown." The American Civil War came and went, tearing the nation apart and legally ending the institution of slavery. But at Oakwood, the social structures were slow to crumble. Thomas and Elizabeth Williams passed away within years of each other, leaving Arthur as the sole master of the crumbling empire. He struggled to maintain the grandeur of the estate in a changing world, his desperation making him even more bitter and arrogant. He married a woman of high standing, further solidifying his place in a society that was desperately clinging to its past. All the while, Maria grew old in the shadows of the house. A silent host who knew the foundation of the entire estate was built on a lie she had told 30 years ago. By 1882, Maria's body finally began to fail her. She was confined to a small, dark room in the servants' wing, her lungs struggling for every breath. The weight of the secret, which she had carried like a leaden weight in her chest, had become an unbearable burden. She knew she was meeting her end, and the thought of taking the truth to her grave began to terrify her. She didn't want Arthur to live a lie anymore. She wanted him to know who he truly was, even if it meant his destruction. She summoned Arthur to her bedside. He came reluctantly, smelling of expensive tobacco and whiskey, looking down at the frail woman with a mix of pity and annoyance. "What is it, Maria?" he asked, his voice dripping with aristocratic boredom. "I have guests arriving for dinner." Maria reached out with a trembling, skeletal hand and gripped his sleeve with a strength that startled him. Her eyes, clouded by age but burning with a sudden, fierce clarity, locked onto his. "Arthur," she rasped, her voice a ghostly whisper, "the blood in your veins, it doesn't belong to the people in the portraits downstairs. It belongs to me. You are my son." The silence that followed was deafening. Arthur pulled back, as if he had been bitten by a snake. He laughed, a harsh, jagged sound, but his face turned a ghostly pale. "You've lost your mind, old woman," he hissed. But Maria didn't let go. She told him everything: the storm, the stillborn child of Elizabeth, the switch in the dark, and the midwife Sarah who was still alive in a nearby town. She told him about the small crescent-shaped birthmark on his hip, a mark that Elizabeth never noticed because Maria was the one who always bathed him. The revelation shattered Arthur's psyche. He fled the room, but the seed was planted. The secret leaked out, perhaps through a servant listening at the door, perhaps through Arthur's own panicked inquiries. Within weeks, the distant cousins of the Williams family, men who had long envied Arthur's fortune, caught wind of the rumor. They sensed an opportunity to reclaim the estate. They tracked down the elderly midwife, Sarah, who was living in poverty. Terrified of God's judgment in her final days, Sarah confessed everything to a lawyer. The subsequent trial was a national sensation. It was dubbed the case of the misplaced hair. The courtroom was a theater of the macabre. Arthur sat in the defendant's chair, his fine clothes now looking like a costume. Maria had passed away only days after her confession, leaving Arthur to face the storm alone. When Sarah took the stand and described that fateful night of 1854 in vivid, haunting detail, the gallery gasped. When the doctor's old journals were produced, confirming a stillbirth that was never officially recorded due to Thomas Williams' pride, the case was sealed. The judge's verdict was cold and final. Arthur was declared an impostor. He was stripped of the Williams name, his lands, his wealth, and his legal identity. The man who had walked into the court as a prince walked out as a ghost. His wife left him, his friends vanished, and the doors of Oakwood were barred against him. Arthur spent his final night on the property at Maria's grave. He stood in the rain, looking at the small, unmarked stone she had placed there for the child he was supposed to be. He realized then the magnitude of Maria's loving love, so fierce it was willing to lose him to save him. He realized that his life of gold had been a cage of glass, and now that it was broken, he was truly alone. Arthur Williams disappeared into the industrial north, changing his name and taking a job as a common laborer. He spent the rest of his life in the very anonymity his mother had died to protect him from. Oakwood Estate eventually fell into ruin, the white pillars collapsing under the weight of time and neglect. But locals say that on stormy September nights, you can still hear the cry of a baby echoing through the trees, a reminder of the night a mother's sin gave a son a world, only for the truth to take it all back.